As the 1930s reached its peak, having recovered from the Western devastation known as the Great Depression, a new decade would usher in a remarkable era of transition, desolation, and nationalism worldwide. However, it was the United States to experience never-ending change with each passing breath. From its attempt at isolationism, to its declaration and strong contribution to the war effort, to its world-proclaimed prosperity as a superpower to be contended with. The 1940s hold a piece of American history focused on the presence of patriotism. This is the United States, and the Homefront which kept it alive.
In the early stages of the war, Americans considered it to be a European conflict, and they desired to stay out of it.
Another war, not for me. This time America should keep out, and I know I will.
This country should heed the advice of its first president and avoid all foreign entanglements.
We'll fight our own battles. They mean nothing to us.
The AFC, or America First Committee, included members like Charles Lindbergh, who encouraged America to maintain its own interests first and remain out of a conflict they did not belong in.
When men are called upon to fight and die for their country, there must not be even the remotest question of foreign influence involved.
America stayed neutral by selling material to both sides of the war to keep up their economic interest after the Great Depression.
However, on December 7, 1941, any perceived notion of remaining uninvolved in the war effort was wiped from the American majority's minds. A previous notion made by the United States government to freeze all Japanese assets, thereby ending trade with the nation, would be a main event leading to the attack on Pearl Harbor. This attack would result in the loss of American military forces and more than 2,000 American lives. Immediately after the attack, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt would declare war upon Japan, therefore ending the United States' attempt at isolationism. Not only would Pearl Harbor initiate America's involvement in the war, it would cause anti-Japanese paranoia to run rampant through the American mind, especially with a major Japanese presence in the West Coast.
Japanese fishermen had every opportunity to watch the movement of our ships. Japanese farmers were living close to vital aircraft plants.
This led to the fear of invasion upon the American mainland. Therefore, it would be the folly of FDR to sign the Executive Order 9066, ordering for the relocation of Japanese Americans to concentration camps. Many assets of the interns were sold, seeing as families were uncertain of the possibility of their return. It made no difference whether or not the accused were born American citizens who had not set a foot in Japan, or World War I veterans, seeing as more than 2/3 of the almost 130,000 interns fell in that category. The camps offered housing, essentials, and schooling for children, yet also housed guards ordered to shoot those who attempted to flee. The surge of anti-Japanese sentiments, along with anti-Nazi sentiments, would take hold of American life in order to highlight the main American enemies and devote one's life to the war effort. This can be perceived in propaganda in the form of pop culture, such as comic book characters fighting Axis foes, or cartoons, notably the acclaimed Disney short featuring Donald Duck as a Nazi, only to wake up from a nightmare, happy to be a proud American citizen.
To be a citizen of the United States of America.
These propaganda methods were purely intended to generate a deep hatred for the Axis and a devotion to the cause of the Allies.
How do you feel now that it has begun? How do you feel it's going to go?
Well, I hope we beat the hell out of them.
In the 1940s, wartime rationing became a big part of life on the home front. War bonds were sold, and rations were used as a way to save material so that it could be used for the war effort, such as feeding soldiers or creating bullets. Ration materials included rubber, leather, metal, nylon, and gasoline, as well as food like sugar, meat, tea, cereal, cheese, jam, coffee, and eggs. Although fruit and vegetables were not rationed, victory gardens were advertised through propaganda to encourage those at home to grow their own food and contribute to the war effort.
It's not the greengrocer's fault. It's up to you. Dig for victory.
Ration ads were targeted at wives and mothers who ran households in their husband's absence. Women were encouraged to do their part at home by not only rationing but joining the workforce. Propaganda was to take up jobs in factories as riveters and welders. They often worked on shipyards and on airplanes. Some women even had a more direct effort in the war, working as nurses and soldiers.
Wherever the American armies will go, wax may follow.
The Women's Auxiliary Air Corps was a group of female pilots who delivered supplies to soldiers. Women's propaganda enforced the patriotism of the era by boosting civil morale and ensuring women that they were doing their part for America.
Who are the women who will help fight our country's war? It's Mary Jones, Jane Doe. It's the idle housewife and the girl next door.
By 1945, 36% of the workforce was made up of women, who are now no longer delegated to women's jobs like secretaries.
General Eisenhower said, "In many jobs, WACs do the work of two men. The Army needs and can use all it can get."
However, women faced workplace harassment and discrimination and received far lower wages than men in the same positions.
Yes, women workers do present problems, Joe. It's tough, I know.
It was hard to work because we didn't have adequate childcare and I couldn't afford to find someone to take care of my children. I was paid less, so finding someone to babysit them was even harder to pay for since I had to pay for my own food as well as theirs. Even they were encouraged to do their part and they collected bottle caps, so all of us were working towards the war effort even if we weren't treated fairly. When men returned from the war, women were also fired or expected to quit their jobs and give them back to the men, and return to their role as housewives and mothers.
Lee Dunning, who now welds on landing barges. And what about after this war, Lee?
Well, this job belongs to some soldier. And when he comes back, he can have it.
These women felt as though they had been unfairly booted from their jobs, and they had adjusted to working and gaining power and status. This began the sentiment that would carry into the 1960s and bring the modern feminist movement.
The movie industry also emerged in the 1940s, producing many popular war films. Anti-war activists spoke out against the movie industry with protests and boycotts. Like the movie industry, music also took a new outlook in the 1940s. The 1940s were the decade of the crooner. Some well-knowns of the era include Bing Crosby, Frank Sinatra, Perry Como. Like everything else in the 1940s, fashion also had a victorious theme, with sharp, trim edges and a modern style. Ladies' fashion was always modest and chic to encourage a strong, elegant aura. Gentlemen were expected to wear plain functional suits, such as zoot suits. The end of World War II came with the Yalta Conference, a meeting between Winston Churchill, Joseph Stalin, and Franklin D. Roosevelt, where they decided to demand Germany's unconditional surrender and began plans for a post-war world, including splitting Germany into 4 zones of occupation. The end of World War II brought the end of isolationism for the U.S. as soldiers returned home from war. After World War II, war was no longer romanticized. War was seen for what it really was, and thus paved the way for future war movements and activists. The U.S. and the USSR were the 2 main powers remaining after World War II, and this foreshadowed the arising of the Cold War. After the decade of World War II and cultural growth in the 1940s of America, The nation was prepared for the prosperity of the 1950s and the upcoming Cold War of the 1960s.